Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The idea that there should be national public lands that belong to and are managed on behalf of the American people is a value that dates back to the founding of our country and is embedded in our Constitution. Generation after generation of Americans have endorsed the idea that our public land should be managed for the benefit of all Americans to support a wide range of uses, including recreation and sportsmen's activities, energy development, and protecting open spaces that provide wildlife habitat, clean water, and clean air. Our nation has also made the commitment that our most significant historical, cultural, and natural sites should be preserved in perpetuity for future generations. These public lands protect some of the places that have shaped and defined who we are as a people and a country and would not have been protected absent support from the federal government. Some of the bills on our agenda this afternoon betray this generational commitment to our nation's public lands and their multi-use mandate. They aim to abandon the federal oversight of public lands and allow private interests to determine the future of our national forests. Instead of looking for bipartisan policy solutions to enhance the many benefits citizens expect and deserve from their public lands, these bills unilaterally abandon the multiple use management philosophy and elevate timber production over all other uses. Promoting the long-term economic vitality of rural economies and counties' neighboring public lands is an important job of this committee, and we should not and do not ignore the benefits of both timber sales and active forest management. Ceding authority over federal land and waiving environmental laws, however, is not the way to make progress on either of these goals. We don't have to look far to see that bipartisan solutions to public lands issues do and can exist. The bills we are considering today by Mr. Polis and Mr. Walden are perfect examples of compromise and cooperation. They both enjoy broad public support here in Congress and in their respective communities. Debates over public land management don't have to divide the country into ideological or regional camps. We need to work together to ensure that our forests, parks, public lands, cultural and heritage sites continue to be managed on behalf of all Americans in a manner that reflects the federal government's important commitment to balance conservation for future generations with sustainable productivity today. It is also important to remember that the conservation itself of public land is not without economic value. It is a backbone of a $646 billion outdoor recreation economy that supports 6.1 million jobs. According to research by Headwaters Economics, a nonpartisan independent think tank from Montana, on average, counties with national parks, wilderness, national monuments, and other forms of protected public lands see increased economic performance. From 1970 to 2014, rural counties with the highest percentage of protected public land have experienced 75% more population growth, 165% more employment growth, and 226% more growth in personal income than counties with smaller percentages of protected public lands. Lastly, I'd like to note that it is also particularly troubling that we are considering these bills just 2 weeks after the end of the armed occupation at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon, an unprecedented takeover of a federal refuge that kept people from their jobs, closed local schools, and put the surrounding communities in a state of shock. At a time like this, we should be working together on bipartisan proposals that strengthen management of our public lands, foster their multi-use mandate for all Americans, and benefit the people who rely on them for their economic livelihoods. Goals the majority of bills before us today fail to advance. Thank you, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I believe we're all concerned about our forest fires, and in some instances, as I am, do watch from afar, but I certainly understand the concern of those communities that have to address them. But I'd like to inject two other facts into the discussion, and that is, first of all, the impact of climate change, as a result of which fire seasons now the length of them is now an average of 78 days longer than in 1970, and this is compounded by the the increasing development in fire-prone areas, which make them more difficult to challenge. And we can't have this discussion without addressing the ever-increasing cost of fighting fires. In 1995, fire suppression made up 16% of the Forest Service annual budget. In 2015, it made up over 50%. And there has also been a 39% reduction in non-fire staff who could invest in, whose job it would be to invest in the restoration and other critically important activities that are taking place and need to take place in our forests. So it's a complicated issue. I appreciate the concerns of those communities that have to deal with it, but I do think we have to look at all the elements of why this is such a challenging, the fire season is so challenging to so many states and so many communities. With that, Mr. Stewart, I'd like to ask you a question. I serve on the Armed Services Committee, and I'm fully supportive of the military's training needs. If the Air Force determines that, and I'm a product of the Air Force, an Air Force brat, if the Air Force determines it needs expanded access to public lands in order to enhance the capacity of the UTR, there is an appropriate way to provide them with that access, and I'm certainly open to discussing how to improve Title I of your bill to make sure that the Department of the Interior is comfortable with the details of the arrangement. But I do have some questions about Title III of the bill. This section would convey rights of way across federal land in 3 Utah counties. And is that land in the identified UTR expansion area?
The roads issue is something that we spent an awful lot of time considering. And RS 2477, as you know, is a very controversial, very emotional issue for people in the West. And my district is no different, and they're represented by others around them. There are, to my knowledge, there's no roads that are currently closed under that rule that would be open. That would be open under the proposed legislation. All this does is guarantee what is already the precedent and already the expectation of these counties, that they would continue to have open access to these roads that they're currently using.
Well, why wrap it into an armed services military issue if
because
it can be dealt with other ways?
The counties are actually giving up something on this. And although only for a few hours a year, about 100 hours a year, there will be road closures as a result of this expansion. And it's important to notice that there is no federal take of lands in this issue. These buffer zones don't actually transfer ownership of any private or state lands to federal control. But it does allow them to have occasional closures as they do these weapons systems testings for safety concerns. And recognizing that those who would be most impacted by that, people living in these very rural districts, we're giving up access, although for a short period of time. In exchange for that, we wanted to give them some surety that these other roads would not be impacted, and that was our intent in allowing that language.
Thank you for your testimony. And Representative Labrador, currently public lands are owned by all Americans. I certainly appreciate that you seek to represent the local interests, but our responsibility on this committee is to represent the interests of all Americans for whom these public lands have been set aside, and the multi-use mandate that is part of that public land heritage. And so in the context of public lands that are owned by all Americans, there's a process for citizens to go through to voice concerns if they're unhappy with how the land is being managed. And by law, the federal government is required to invoke the public in decision making. How does your bill have a similar requirement, or does it have a similar requirement for involving all members of the public in decision making? And in that context, can you talk about the advisory committee and the representatives that are going to be serving on that?
Yes, the advisory committee has one member who holds county or local elected office, one member who represents the commercial timber, wood products, or milling industry, one member who represents persons holding federal grazing or other use permits, and one member who represents recreational users of National Forest System lands. But as I indicated, you can also have other members. Each governor can have more members available to them. We're also open to any suggestions that you might have to improve the bill and to make it more representative. But I still think, you addressed the issue of climate change in the beginning. We disagree on climate change, but let's assume that we did. Wouldn't you want to make it easier for us to prevent fires on these lands? And I think that's the problem that I have with sometimes the position that you would take, is that if we actually manage it at the local level, we're going to have less forest fires, not more. Whatever the cause is, whether it's climate change, whether it's poor management or whatever, we should be doing whatever it's necessary for us to actually prevent those forest fires. Thank you very much.
Mr. Lamalfa.